Cold bites different when you know nobody's coming. That was what Clover had learned in the 2 years since she'd buried her father on the eastern slope of the Yellowhead Pass and stayed behind when everyone else had the good sense to leave. Not the cold of a house that hadn't been heated yet, not the polite cold of a city winter. The cold of the high Rockies in late October was a living thing. It pressed itself against the cabin walls and found every crack she hadn't chinked properly, and it crept across the floor at night like something with intentions. She was splitting kindling when she heard the horses. Eck. The sound came down wrong off the ridge. The wind was pushing northwest, which meant she heard the hooves before she saw the dust, and she heard them with a particular quality that tightened the muscles between her shoulder blades. Not one horse, not a traveler moving purposefully down the trail. 3, maybe 4, moving at an unhurried pace that meant that they weren't lost. Men who ride slow toward an isolated property aren't in a hurry because they don't need to be. Clover set the hatchet down against the chopping block and straightened up. She was 27 years old, and she had her father's eyes and her mother's jaw, and she had spent the last 8 months being too proud to go back to Edmonton, where her sister kept insisting she belonged. The homestead wasn't much. A one-room log cabin her father had built in stages over 15 years, a leaning barn with a sway-backed mare named Rook inside it, 43 acres of spruce and frozen creek bed that nobody in their right mind would try to farm. But it was hers, and the shotgun was inside, mounted on 2 wooden pegs above the door frame. She didn't run for it. Running showed calculation. She didn't want them to know she'd done the math. 3 men rode out of the tree line. The one in front was narrow-shouldered and wore a red flannel shirt under an open canvas duster, which was either stupidity or the kind of confidence that came from not having been cold in a long time. He had pale eyes and a mouth that sat in a permanent half-smile, like he was watching a joke unfold that hadn't quite landed yet. The 2 behind him were less interesting. One was broad across the chest with a week of dark stubble and the dead, incurious eyes of a man accustomed to following instructions. The other was young enough that it was sad. They reined in at the edge of the yard. "Afternoon," the one in front said. His voice was the kind of pleasant that took effort to maintain. "We were hoping you might have something warm to drink. Coffee, if you've got it. Long ride down from the camp. There's a town 12 kilometers back east," Clover said. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. "The general store keeps a stove going." "Sure," the man said. "Sure it does." He swung down from his horse without being invited. His name, she would find out later, was Renfield, though everyone in the logging camps up the valley called him something shorter and meaner. He had a reputation that moved ahead of him like a smell. He wasn't the kind of man who took no for an answer primarily because he'd never had to. He landed in the frozen mud with a crunch and smiled at her with all those teeth. "We're not really looking for town. We're looking at this place right here." Clover turned and walked toward the cabin door. She made it 3 steps. The broad-shouldered one moved faster than she expected. He caught her by the back of her coat, the collar digging into her throat, and jerked her off her feet. She hit the porch railing sideways, the wood cracking against her hip bone, and went down onto the boards in a wash of bright pain. Her ears rang. She tasted copper. She rolled, put a boot into something soft, and heard a grunt, got herself onto her hands and knees and kept crawling for the door. Because the shotgun was in there and everything else was secondary, she got her hand on the door frame. Renfield's boot came down on her wrist. The sound she made wasn't a scream. It was a breath that turned into something animal. He leaned his weight onto it, watching her with that patient half-smile, and she clawed at the boards with her free hand and found nothing, and thought, clearly and without panic. This is how it ends, on the porch of a cabin in the mountains, and my sister's going to be so angry at me for not leaving when she said to. Then the forest made a sound. It was hard to describe afterward, not a crack like a falling branch. Something lower than that, a vibration more than a sound, the kind of thing that travelled through the ground before it reached the ear. Renfield looked up. The man who walked out of the spruce line was not a man you expected. He was massive in the particular way of something that has never had to compensate for its size. Big across the chest and through the neck, with the kind of stillness that belongs to things that don't need to announce themselves. He wore a heavy canvas and cool coat that had seen a decade of weather, and he carried a felling axe in his right hand with the casual grip of a man who had forgotten it was there. His face was hard to read, not because it was blank, but because it was too still, like stone that has been rained on long enough to look like it grew there. He didn't call out. He didn't slow down. He walked across the yard with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already decided how this ended. Renfield let go of Clover's wrist. What in the young one started, he never finished. The big man didn't use the axe. He set it against the porch rail with a deliberateness that was somehow more frightening than rage, and then he put his hand on Renfield's chest and walked him backward. It didn't look like a shove. It looked like a redirection, like weather. Renfield hit the post at the end of the porch railing, and the wood snapped, and he went down into the frozen dirt on his back, and the sound of his head connecting with the ground was the sound a melon makes when it falls off a counter. The broad-shouldered one came in swinging. It didn't go well for him. The big man moved with the efficiency of someone who had never been taught to fight, but had been in enough situations that his body had arrived. At its conclusions, he caught the swinging arm, turned, and put the man down in a way that bent his elbow at a direction it didn't go. The scream was brief. The young one took one look at all of it, turned his horse around, and rode back the way he'd come at a speed that suggested he had revised his opinions considerably. Then there was quiet. The wind moved through the spruce trees. Somewhere in the barn, Rook shifted and stamped. Clover was still on the porch. She had gotten herself sitting upright, with her back against the cabin wall, her injured wrist held against her chest, her eyes tracking the big man as he stood over Renfield's unconscious form and looked down at him without expression. She pulled herself upright using the door frame and went inside. She found the shotgun. She came back to the door and leveled it at the big man's back. He turned around, slowly. He looked at the barrels, then at her face. His eyes were a very dark grey, the color of the sky over the mountains just before the snow comes in. He didn't raise his hands. He just stood there and looked at her with the complete absence of surprise, like he had expected this and found it reasonable. "Don't come inside," she said. Her voice was mostly steady. He nodded once. He walked to the edge of the porch, picked up his axe, and sat down on the top step with his back to her and his face to the yard. He pulled a piece of cord from his coat pocket and began working a knot in it with his thick fingers, doing nothing, keeping watch. Clover stood in the doorway for a long time with the shotgun. Eventually she went inside and sat in the chair by the stove and listened to the sound of him breathing on the porch. It was a slow sound, unhurried, like the river sounds when it's deep enough that nothing bothers it. She didn't sleep, but she didn't hear anything else all night. His name was Val. She found that out the next morning, when she brought him a cup of coffee he hadn't asked for and stood in the doorway, and said, "I'm Clover." His head turned, just enough to indicate he'd heard her. "Val," he said, and that was the whole of it. He didn't explain where he'd come from, or what he was doing in the mountains west of the pass. He didn't ask her why she lived alone out here or where her people were. He drank the coffee, standing up, facing the yard, as if he felt responsible for keeping an eye on it. When he handed back the cup, his fingers were warm despite the temperature, which she noticed without meaning to. He asked if the mare needed her feet looked at. He said it by asking whether she'd noticed the way the horse was landing on the left front. And she hadn't, but she'd also had other things on her mind lately. He took the mare's foot without fuss and packed the crack in the hoof wall with pine tar while Rook stood perfectly still. Horses didn't usually stand still for strangers. Clover filed that away. He spent the morning splitting wood. He didn't ask permission. He found the axe she kept by the barn, and he worked through the rounds she'd been avoiding, because her shoulder had been bad, and the sound of it carried clean across the frozen yard, a steady rhythm she could work inside to without thinking about it. She patched the section of chinking above the south window that had been letting cold air in all month. She made bread that didn't burn, mostly because she was paying attention for once, instead of letting her thoughts wander to all the ways the place was falling apart faster than she could hold it together. At noon she brought him food. He ate it on the porch. Neither of them said anything much. She told herself this was temporary. She told herself he would be gone by morning. She told herself she was managing the situation with clear eyes and practical sense, which was exactly what her father would have told her to do. And she almost believed it until she noticed that the post he'd sat against all night had a dent in it, from his shoulders, and something about that detail made her throat close in a way she couldn't quite explain. 12 days. That's how long it took for Clover to stop flinching when she heard his boots on the porch boards. He slept outside for the first 6 nights, rolled in a canvas bedroll next to the door, with his coat pulled over him like something that had long ago made peace with discomfort. On the 7th night, it dropped to -22, and she left the door open before she went to sleep, and in the morning his bedroll was on the floor beside the stove, and she didn't say a word about it. The following night, she left the door open again. After that, it became the arrangement without either of them naming it. He was not a man who talked to fill the silence. She'd been surrounded her whole life by people who treated silence as a problem to be solved, a gap to be plugged with words before it got uncomfortable. Her sister talked from the moment she woke up until the moment she went to sleep. A constant running commentary on the world and her opinions about it. And Clover had always found it exhausting in a way she felt guilty about. Val moved through the day the way the mountains moved, which was to say he was simply there, present, not requiring anything of her. She watched him from the window sometimes. She noticed things she wouldn't have said out loud. The way he always stopped at the edge of the property line to look at the tree line before coming back in, checking. The way he kept the hatchet within reach, but handled it with the kind of thoughtless care that came from it being genuinely useful rather than ornamental. The way he'd found the one spot in the cabin floor that creaked and started stepping over it, not because she'd asked him to, but because she'd flinched at the sound once, the first night, and he'd remembered. He was boiling water for coffee when she finally asked him. She'd been waiting until it felt ordinary, until he was standing in her kitchen the way a person stands in a kitchen they've stood in 100 times, and his back was to her, and the water was starting to steam, and she said, "Where were you before?" He didn't turn around. He said, "North. The Rockies go a long way north," she said. He was quiet for a moment, up past the headwaters of the Liard. 7 years, trapping, mostly, a little guiding, not much of either. 7 years, she said. He poured the water without responding. She looked at his hands around the pot. The knuckles were heavy with old scarring. His wrists had the thick, roped look of someone who had spent years hauling weight and bracing against cold. 7 years was a long time to spend above the 60th parallel without much human company. She tried to imagine it and found she couldn't quite get there. "Why'd you come down?" she asked. He set the pot back on the stove. He turned around. His face in the morning light was deeply weathered, not ugly, not handsome, just thoroughly used and entirely unapologetic about it. He looked at the cup in his hands. "Second winter up there," he said. "I went through the ice on a lake I'd crossed 50 times before. Water was 40 below air temperature. I went under and I came back up and I got myself out, and I walked 3 kilometers back to the camp, and I got a fire going." He paused. When I stopped shaking, I realized I hadn't been scared of dying. He looked up. I'd been scared that nobody would know, that I'd go under and the ice would close over, and by spring there'd be no sign at all. She looked at him. "That's a different thing," she said. "That's a different thing," he agreed. He sat down at the table. After that, it started to feel stupid to be up there alone. Clover wrapped her hands around her cup. Outside the window, the snow that had been threatening all week was finally coming down, slow and deliberate, covering the yard in white. "I know how that feels," she said quietly. She wasn't talking about drowning. He looked at her for a moment. She thought he was going to say something. Instead, he nodded, just once, and looked out at the snow, and they sat in silence that didn't need filling. She found the note on the 15th morning. It was stuck under the coffee pot, a piece of birch bark with writing on it in pencil, the letters, square and even, the handwriting of a man who'd taught himself and took it seriously. "Gone to Clearwater for supplies. 3 days, maybe 4. Weather dependent, rifles on the peg. Use it." She stood in the kitchen and read it 3 times. She wasn't angry. She was surprised to discover she wasn't angry. She was something else, something more unsettled, something that had to do with how quiet the cabin was, all of a sudden, even though it had been quiet before he came and she'd been perfectly fine with that. She made herself busy. She started on the broken section of the south fence line she'd been putting off. She tarred the barn roof where the seam had been leaking. She baked 2 loaves of bread, and one of them didn't burn, and she ate it with butter and felt proud about it for approximately 4 minutes before the quiet closed back in. The second day she found herself listening for sounds she couldn't identify. On the third day the birds stopped. She was at the woodpile when it happened. The grey jays that lived in the spruce along the western edge of the property were racketing away in their usual morning argument, and then they weren't, all at once. A sudden absence of sound that pressed against her eardrums. Clover set the wood down. She had grown up partly in the Caribou before her parents moved north, and her father had said, "When the birds stop it, means something that eats birds is nearby. Men qualify," he'd said, "because anything that moves through the bush without caring about the noise it makes is something to think about." She went inside. She checked the rifle Val had left. A lever-action .3008 with a scope she'd never used, heavier than the shotgun, with a kick she didn't know yet. She worked the lever. A brass shell gleamed in the receiver. She snapped it closed. She went to the window. There were 4 of them. They came out of the western tree line on horseback, picking their way across the snowy slope with the patience of men who weren't worried about being seen. Renfield was in front. Someone had set his nose after she'd broken it, but it had healed crooked, sitting off-center on his pale face. He wore a proper coat this time. The men with him were different from the ones before. They sat in the saddle like hired work, which was what they were. She could tell by the way they kept their gun hands free. She counted Renfield, 3 others. And Val's wagon was coming down the eastern trail. She heard it before she saw it, the familiar creak of the wheel over a frozen rut, and her stomach turned over in a way that had nothing to do with fear for herself. She pressed her back against the wall beside the window, angled so she could see both the approaching riders and the trail to the east, and she did the geometry of the situation very quickly. Renfield hadn't come back for her. He'd come back for what she'd called to witness. He'd brought men who did this for money because the last time had not gone the way he planned, and he intended to make an example. Val drove the wagon out of the pines and into the open yard without breaking stride. He saw them. She knew he saw them because she could see the almost imperceptible change in how he was sitting, the way the shoulders squared. He didn't turn around, to a stop, and sat for a long moment without moving. Renfield called out, across the yard, something ugly, something about settling accounts. Val wrapped the reins around the brake handle. He stood up in the wagon, and he looked at the 4 men with that same stone-still expression, the one that had no anger in it because it had moved past anger a long time ago. His right hand dropped behind the seat, and came up with a rifle of his own. A long one, a Marlin with a tube magazine. He held it at his side. "I'm going to tell you once," he said. His voice didn't rise to carry. "It just carried. You should have kept going." Clover watched one of the hired men reach for his pistol. She threw open the cabin door. She planted her boots on the porch boards in the cold air. She'd never actually used this rifle before. She knew where the safety was and how the lever worked, and that was going to have to be enough. She brought the stock up to her shoulder and found the hired man's outline in the scope and said, loud and flat, "Leave." Every face in the yard turned toward her. For a moment, nothing moved. The snow fell. The horses stood. Then Renfield said something short and vicious, and the yard came apart. Clover had always been told that time slows down in moments of violence. It didn't. Everything happened in a rush of noise and muzzle flash and the sharp smell of burnt powder, and she fired twice and worked the lever between shots, and the kick of it sang up through her shoulder into her teeth. She kept her eyes open. She didn't think about anything except the sight line. One of the hired men went off his horse. Another wheeled his animal around and rode for the trees. Renfield fired at the wagon, and she heard the wood crack, and she saw Val take something in the side. Not the flat, stopping impact of a clean hit, but the glancing jerk of a graze, and he staggered, but he didn't drop the rifle. He put the Marlin to his shoulder and fired once, and Renfield's horse screamed and bolted into the spruce. And then there was nothing moving in the yard, except drifting smoke and disturbed snow. Clover lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking. They hadn't been shaking while she was shooting, which she found interesting. She walked across the yard toward the wagon. The snow soaked through her boots immediately. She walked fast. And she told herself it was because she needed to assess the situation, and it wasn't entirely a lie. Val was sitting on the edge of the wagon bed, his coat open, pressing his forearm against his side. His face had gone pale beneath the weathering. He looked up as she came toward him. "You were supposed to stay inside," he said. She stopped in front of him. She reached out and pulled his forearm away from his ribs to see what was underneath. It was a gouge more than a hole, a furrow of torn skin, and bruised muscle along the lowest rib, bleeding freely. Bad enough, not fatal. She pressed his arm back against it. "I don't do that," she said. She meant more than staying inside. He looked at her, his dark grey eyes in the flat winter light. He said, "I know." There was snow in his hair. She put her free hand up and brushed it off without thinking, and then left her hand against his jaw for a moment before she took it back. He stayed very still. His breath made white clouds in the cold air. "We need to get inside," she said. "That needs to be cleaned." He nodded. He pushed himself off the wagon with one arm, and she put her shoulder under his good side without being asked, and they walked across the yard together through the falling snow. The hired men were gone or down. Renfield was somewhere in the spruce, with a spooked horse and a new understanding of what his choices had cost him. She didn't think he would come back. Val had a way of being certain about things that made her tend to believe him. She helped him up the porch steps and through the door. Inside, the fire was still going. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the particular warmth of a small closed space that has been lived in by two people, which was different from the smell of a space lived in by one. She sat him down at the table and found the clean cloth and the whiskey she kept for purposes other than drinking, and she went to work without ceremony. Because that was how her father had taught her, and because ceremony didn't suit either of them. He sat without moving while she cleaned the wound. He was very good at stillness. When she finished, she tied off the bandage and sat back. He was watching her, not with the careful, controlled look he usually wore, but with something quieter underneath it, something that had been there long enough to have grown used to itself. "You didn't have to come out," he said. She started rolling up the leftover cloth. "I know that. You could have stayed down." She looked up at him. "I don't know how to do that." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, closer to a recognition. "I know," he said again, Outside, the snow was coming harder now. It made a sound on the roof, like someone very gently and repeatedly saying the same word until you heard it. The fire snapped. Somewhere out past the tree line, the last of the light was going, turning the mountains from grey to the particular blue that only exists in winter at elevation, a colour so cold and so complete that it becomes its own kind of comfort. He put his uninjured hand on the table, palm up. She looked at it for a long moment, then she set hers on top of it, and he closed his fingers, and they sat in the warmth of the fire, while the dark came down over the mountains outside. She didn't say anything about what it meant. Neither did he. They didn't need to, some things. Some things settle into place without words, the way snow settles onto a slope that's waited all autumn for it, the way a door fits a frame that was built for exactly that door, the way the silence between two people who have survived the same storm becomes something you'd choose instead of noise. Clover looked at the fire. She thought about her sister, who would want to hear everything, who would ask 100 questions, who would probably cry, who was not wrong that this life was hard. She thought about her father's hands, how similar they'd looked to the hand holding hers now. She thought about 2 winters. From tonight, whether the fence would still need mending, whether Rook's foot would give her trouble, whether the bread would keep burning, or whether that was something that could be learned. Outside, the snow covered everything that had happened in the yard. By morning you wouldn't know.